Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Arvind Sethumadhavan. I work for Dentsu Aegis network. We are a global marketing services organization. The title of the presentation is Hit Refresh, Wellbeing in the Digital Economy. We all aware that the digital economy is doing some wonderful things. Today and yesterday, you would have heard about some great startup stories, how there are unicorns being built. One of the things we realized is while the digital economy is doing a lot of fantastic stuff for startups, etc., a question we asked ourselves is the digital economy benefiting everybody? Is it benefiting all parts of the business? So we started exploring the theme of what does good look like when it comes to the digital economy impacting everybody. So we released a white paper, and this talk is about the white paper. I'm going to start by giving you a very high level view of the findings, starting with a video which should wake any of you up who are dozing off and have not had the coffee. So data is an important fabric of the digital economy. We all live digital footprints as we go about our everyday lives. We've all heard the stories about data and what's happening in terms of data breaches, lawsuits, etc. This is at the center of the report. There is a trust deficit. This is a key finding from the report. If you look at these charts here, the first point is about misuse of personal data. You can see that Asia is quite pronounced on this. So in the context of trust and digital data, we started looking at the Maslow's hierarchy of needs and starting to understand how does this manifest itself for the digital economy. We looked at 4 areas. The first is basic needs, just availability of digital infrastructure. Second is psychological needs in terms of the health and well-being of people. The third is self-fulfillment needs. Does it empower people to succeed in whatever they're doing, running a business, being a homemaker, or whatever they do? And finally, societal needs. Does it impact all people? This was a survey done across 43,000 people across the world, 24 markets. And we calculated what is called a digital society index and ranked all the markets. We're all based here in Singapore, and you can see that Singapore ranks number 1. The digital society index ranks countries on 3 parameters: dynamism, inclusiveness, and trust. Singapore is ahead of both United States and China. This is great news, but are there some hidden facts behind these which we need to take care of? I mentioned 4 areas. I mentioned the 4 areas which DSI tracks. If we look at these 4 areas of basic needs, psychological needs, self-fulfillment needs, and societal needs, one area where there is a significant imbalance is psychological needs. Yes, there is a lot of opportunities with digital. I'm sure People are addicted to their phones all the time, but it's creating some challenges for the people. If you look at what are the parameters around these, there was a terminology which was created some time back called FOMO, fear of missing out. This is huge in Asia. You can see that when it comes to psychological barriers, it manifests itself in two forms. One is people feeling that the pace of technology is outpacing themselves, and a lot of times digital is not giving them the skills to succeed. We have to keep in mind an important parameter in the context of Asia Pacific, which is demographics. So we will find that in a lot of the markets there's an aging population that could be a driver of the skills issue. But on the positive side, people in APAC markets are very optimistic about tech's future. One of the things which is coming out time and again about artificial intelligence and machine learning is loss of jobs. But in APAC, people feel that there are going to be great career opportunities out of these technological innovations, which is actually positive. When we look at it, Asia has been early adopter. People lean into technologies. People are much more comfortable with robots, right? Sony was the first company which created robots, and people are very comfortable living with them. So just to wrap up, the digital economy imperatives around three areas. For brands, it's about experiences. It's about deep personal experiences which make a meaningful change. For businesses, it's about competing on openness. It's about making sure that as you use digital data, you're also responsible. And for governments, it's about basically creating balance scorecards which empowers people to succeed. So with that, I'm just not going to hand over to Michelle, who's going to grill us on what are the reasons for this report and how we can make better of some of the insights.
I'll be kind. Thank you, Arvind. That really forms the backbone of our discussion today, the report. So I'd first just like to have each panelist introduce themselves, and then we'll kick off the discussion. Just please tell us who you are, where you're from, how you fit into the conversation, and then if you would entertain an icebreaker question. Just what one question, if you were all-knowing, what one question about the digital society would you want answered? What would you like to know?
Okay. Well, I guess I'll start. First of all, thank you, Dentsu, for inviting us, Microsoft, to the panel. My name is Richard Koh. I'm the Chief Technology Officer here at Microsoft Singapore. Just a little bit by myself. I started my career actually in Redmond as part of the team that built Office 365 12, 13 years ago, so it's been a long time. But that was another story in itself. What's really great about this topic that we're talking about is it's around how technology is so pervasive in our lives, and what should it do, and how does it impact us. And on that icebreaker about if I'm all-knowing, what would I like to know about it is really, when I think about it, it's like, will my children not have to work for a living, but really enjoy what they're doing and still be productive? And if that can be answered, that would be just fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. So my name is Lina. I'm the Assistant CEO of the Infocom Media Development Authority. And one of the functions that I oversee is the digital readiness function, and that really aims to help the entire society, the segments of society that are probably not as digitally conversant, to keep up with the developments in technology and the digital economy. Because Singapore is both a city, but we are also a nation, and even as we move on smart city, smart nation, the whole of society needs to move along for us to avoid harms like greater digital divides. So that is what I do as a job. And Richard, I think the answer to your question is no, actually. Your children will still have to work for a living. There's no two ways about it. Now, when we think about digital society at IMDA, I think the big question for us is always how, right? Because the segment that we are dealing with is the long tail, right? We're dealing with the seniors, the people who may not be so well educated, persons with disabilities, and the question is how to help them to deal with the complexity that we are seeing in the digital economy in a very simple and accessible manner.
Good. I think you can hear me okay? I think I'm still mic'd up. So from my perspective, I think when I look at digital society, it's about technologies and digital impacting all layers of society. I look at funding, you look at VC funding, all of them today is going to profit-oriented organizations. What I would like to see is a funding mechanism which is not based on profit, but which is based on GDP growth. We talk about smart cities, we talk about smart nations, but imagine you look at areas which are growing, which is not the urban landscapes, rural areas where you can then get funding based on economic growth of those regions.
All right, all good questions, and hopefully you three can provide good answers to those questions and more in this discussion. I should probably mention I'm Michelle Jamrisko. I'm from Bloomberg, a Southeast Asia economy correspondent. And I'm here today, as I said, mainly to kind of build questions off the backbone of this report. One thing that I really appreciate is that it's so focused on the consumer. You know, often we talk only about the business response or only about the government response, but really this is about getting back to the basics. What are we responding to? An entrepreneur told me recently that Blockbuster wasn't killed by Netflix. Blockbuster killed itself by not recognizing late fees. And so it was just kind of a lesson or reminder in responding to the needs of the consumer. So what I want to do today is separate our discussion into 3 different categories, and I want to start with the consumer and then move on to what do businesses and governments do in response to meet the needs of the digital society. So first, let's start with a statistic. Arvind, he outlined quite a few statistics from this report, all very interesting, some encouraging, some discouraging. And often, in the news world at least, we're talking about, you know, the big question, will robots steal my job or your job or other people's jobs? And what do we do about that to prepare or prevent it? But I want to start with a stat from the report that seemed pretty encouraging to me, and that is that 47% in APAC believe that emerging technology will actually create jobs for them versus 36% worldwide. So first I want to ask the panelists, what do you make of this stat? Is it surprising or as you expected, and is it encouraging, or would you hope that it would have been higher?
Should I start first? Okay. I think the stats that was presented was in many ways encouraging. I think at Microsoft we fundamentally believe that technology can be used for a force of good, and as we looked at what technology should do and not just only what it can do, if we direct it the right way, there is a huge amount of challenges that's happening in society today that we can direct the technology to help address. Just think about it. All of us sitting down here, most, if not all of us, are very able-bodied. We can see with our eyes, hear with our ears. But if you think about it, there is about 1 billion people living on the planet today with some form of, permanent or temporary disability. And if you think about technologies like AI, for example, the ability for computers, machine to be able to perceive, to be able to understand, to be able to listen, then if we direct some of these technologies to help those 1 billion people, I think that's something that is a force for good. So those could be the jobs of the future. Those could be areas that society, educational institutions, businesses, governments can really direct where the technology should be going, so that it helps society. And in that process, I believe that new kind of jobs that we have never seen before will be created.
Lena, Arvind, any thoughts? Were you as upbeat about that stat?
Yeah. So when we talk about jobs, I think if you look at the Asia-Pacific region, many of the economies in Asia-Pacific, including Singapore, have benefited from technology, right, and have benefited from the tech revolution or evolution that we have seen in the past few years, and we have seen a lot of GDP growth, tremendous job creation that has come about because of technology. So when you say that people in APAC are generally more welcoming of technology and understand that it can create new economic opportunities. That is not surprising to us. In fact, it is very helpful for the work that we do in digital society, because at the macro level, there will be more jobs, but at the individual level, what we need is also for people to understand that the nature of jobs will change. The skills that you need for your job will also change. And for us to be able to persuade you to train, retrain, persuade you that, changing jobs in an entire career because of technology is not uncommon, right? A very good start for us is for people to see it as opportunity rather than as a threat.
Yeah, I agree. For the last few years, we've been looking at this concept of Asia's digital disruption, primarily around the point that if you look at everything that's happening in Asia, it's leapfrogging the Western economies. And the primary concept, this was a hypothesis we started way back in 2015, and what is absolutely evident is that Asian consumers are early adopters of most technologies. They lean in, they latch onto it. You look at anything from virtual reality, augmented reality, robotics. I think Pokemon, the success of Pokemon is a great example. I don't have the stats on the back of my hand, but if you look at the gaming leaderboard for Pokemon, Asian markets would be leading. If you look at any of the gaming stats, I think Korea and Singapore are the leaders, right? So Asian consumers have been leaning in heavily. They are early adopters of technology, so that stat is not surprising. What, if anything, I would say is worrying is the point I made about fear of missing out, which is potentially leading to addiction, internet addiction. I think the World Health Organization last year, for the first time, have classified internet addiction as a health disease. It started based on something which happened in China a couple of years back. There are now health clinics which treat internet addiction, but that's a potential fallout. But definitely Asian consumers are early adopters. We feel that is why Asia can be the prototype of experimentation and innovation for the globe.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, especially about early adopters and what it means to have some of these bleaker stats around addiction, perhaps more so in this region. Leads into my next stat that I wanted to cite from the report, and that is that just 28% see digital technology helping their psychological needs versus 38% globally. So here's where APAC is a little bit less optimistic about how digital technology fits into their lives. One thing I want to ask, though, is whether this might be a product, I'm an economy reporter, is this perhaps a product of the atmosphere that we live in, where there's a lot of bad news out there, not so much opportunity on the jobs front globally, if you talk just in sweeping frames, and a lot of risk on the business side, on the consumer side, from government perspective. How much of that do you think is going to be here 10 years from now versus, okay, maybe some of these glum feelings have to do with people's personal situations that have to do with the global economic environment right now? Any thoughts on the change that might be ahead?
Yep.
All right. Let me try and offer a slightly different view on that stats. It's interesting when you talk about 28%, right? Like, digital technology is not helping with the psychological needs. I thought it was kind of a good news, right? Because I think people are getting the joy of missing out. Have you all heard of that term? I'm sure some of you have. JOMO, right? Instead of FOMO. And if you think about this psychologically, and that's some of the studies that's done, on the human interaction with technology itself. You can have that kind of absorption into technology itself. It makes you narcissistic, posting that post on social media and telling the whole world how good it is. But in actual fact, it really makes you lonely. Those kind of things, and I've done this, sometimes with myself. It's just putting away the technology. Yes, I know I'm the CTO at Microsoft, but when you put away the technology and you start listening to whether is it the sound of nature or just a conversation itself, I think it is something that we as humans have been wired to do since civilization has started. And I think this is something that we need to reconnect back and really dig deep into ourselves, because what it really means is that technology is something that helps us to do something better. But on a psychological level, it doesn't necessarily be the answer to it. It can be something else. It can be interactions with your friends, your family, or your colleagues, but on a personal level and wider society as well. So technology is not necessarily the answer to everything.
Small doses.
So actually, I do agree fully with Richard on this point, that when we look at the fact that, people respond by saying that they are somehow sort of fearful or not so comfortable with the benefits of technology, that is to us not necessarily a bad thing as well. It will be a lot more dangerous if everybody thinks that everything about technology is good. And then we don't get the discernment that we are looking for. We don't get the thinking through or responsible use of technology that we are looking for as well. So one example, when the Media Literacy Council in Singapore launched the Better Internet campaign, which we run every year in Singapore, and it's launched on Safer Internet Day. This year's theme is actually #OneClickAway. Right, and the whole underlying premise for that is think before you click, right? So to a large extent, actually, I think it's not a bad thing that that people know that there are harms that can be, that can come to you if you click wrongly, right? You may be engaged in cyberbullying. You may have clicked on a fake news website and believed it. To some extent, this stat does help in the discernment that we are looking for as well.
Yeah, I think, one of the things we've been looking at and we talk about when it comes to the impact of technology on people's life is the experience. Right? Increasingly, today's world is about the experience economy. A lot of time when you look at marketing, for instance, a lot of organizations have been culprits of playing out traditionally how you would just interrupt people's experiences and stick an ad, right? Imagine you're watching something, really nice piece of content, and poof, you need to get an ad. So we've been focusing heavily on building experiences using digital technologies, and that could change the barriers to the way people look at the psychology of what digital does to them. To give you an example, a couple of months back, one of our businesses, Isobar, they launched an app for Volkswagen. The context being, I think 7 in 10 people who are sitting in the back seat of a car when they are driving, they're looking at their screens, which is obvious. I was actually surprised it was only 7 in 10. And they're not looking at the surroundings. And the whole, the concept of this app is it's called Road Tales, because if you look outside, there are a lot of things which happen outside. So the app actually creates location-based triggers of tales. This was launched just a couple of months back in Amsterdam. So an example would be, as you're driving down the highway, there's a windmill. The app talks about what windmill does, how much energy it generates. If there is a historic site, it talks about the history behind the site and the stories. Now importantly, the app was an audio app, because obviously you don't want people actually looking at the screen and looking at another piece of content. So that's again an example of how digital can build an experience which takes you away from the screen into the real world and experience what's out there. We talk about this bridging of online and offline. So experiences are going to be key to how we change that score for the psychological challenge of digital technologies.
really responding to those needs there. So we've kind of identified a few needs from the consumer angle. We've talked about the consumer wanting or seeing digital technology as a force for good. Some 56% in APAC versus 45% globally, so that's another optimistic stat. We identified that they generally, about half believe that technology can create jobs for them versus a less optimistic view globally. And what else did we? We said the digital technology is not so much helping the psychological needs. So in that mix of reviews, we're going to talk about from a business perspective, what do businesses do about that? And first I want to ask more of a personal question. I love the report's first recommendation about the digital detox, and we've already mentioned a few ways that arbiters of technology can kind of help consumers not go overboard and kind of moderate their technology intake and unplug. There are great stories about Bill Gates and Steve Jobs raising their kids relatively tech-free, among other Silicon Valley and other tech entrepreneurs worldwide. And I wanted to know, of you three, how do you approach this in your personal life and with your families, friends, even coworkers? Do you discourage overload of technology? Is there any sort of policy at your office in Microsoft to kind of dial back a little bit?
So you want to know about the personal side or the
all of
office
the
side?
above?
Oh, okay. Let me try on the personal side a little bit. So at home, I've got two young boys. One's a teen and one's a tween. So some of you are parents here, yes? Yeah, you're struggling with their screen time more often than not, yes? Okay. So there's a couple of things that I do with my kids. I really pity them having a CTO as their father because I have every single ways and means to be able to control their use of technology. And what that means is that I do limit their screen time. By the way, Microsoft Windows has a great family feature there that I can control the amount of time that they spend online as well as which time of the day and all that. Go check it out. But it's the same. It's the same thing. What I do at a very high level is literally I would switch off the internet. Well, for them, not for me. I cannot live without it. But and just make sure that we do spend time to have a real conversation itself, right? So no devices at the dining table, things like that, and find activities to do because you want them to grow up not having to have their self-esteem being built based on, let's say, for example, social media itself. So I think these are some of the traps that I really watch out for, and it's interesting because this generation that's growing up, that's in school right now, very well versed digitally. They were born with all this in place already, and in the conversations I've had with my sons, they have told me they don't see the need of having their social media presence at all, and they have learned about some of the pitfalls with that as well. So it's really amazing. I think in many ways they are a little bit more educated about the pitfalls of that and how it affects their psychological well-being as well. So that's a little bit of something I do at home. At the office, this is something that's interesting. So it's an evolution of what we did with Office 365, and in the service itself, we have an intelligent agent called Cortana. So some of you are Halo Wars fans. The Cortana is the AI in Halo, and in the Xbox game Halo. Cortana itself, now today, you can instruct Cortana to literally build focus time into your calendar so that it gets blocked out, and you can spend time, maybe doing on a project or something like that. You want some focus time. So these are some of the ways that we are looking within the company itself on how some of these collaboration and productivity solutions can help workers to not say detox per se, but really think about how are they using their times during the workday itself. Focus times for themselves, to read, to recharge, to exercise, something like that. So check it out.
How about over at IMDA?
Sure. So definitely for my own two children, yeah, I also wish that they did less with the screen, and we do have limits. And Richard is right that these young kids somehow they are born very tech conversant, and in fact, just a really funny story, right? My son, when he was 3 years old, he was looking at the monitor of the desktop computer, and he was using it as a touch screen to scroll down. But because the grandmother was controlling the mouse right by his side, he actually thought that the monitor was a touch screen, and to them, things just work. You touch and it works. And that's how the young people are growing up with. But just to share, actually, before I came back to IMDA, I was with the Early Childhood Development Agency. So definitely, if you're a parent or you have human-to-human interactions, interactions at a personal level are very important, especially for children, and they can never be replaced by screens or robots. And that's backed by evidence. And in the work context, actually, when we think about teaching our population to be tech conversant, even the young children, we are not actually teaching them to use screens, right? But more it's around teaching them logic, teaching them computational thinking skills, and that can be done through simple games, right? It can be done through blogs, it can be done even without engaging in coding, but really teaching them how to think about the logic behind a computer. And when you do that, then it is much easier to then teach them about, for example, do you understand AI, right? Do you know what the recommendation engine is doing when it's recommending you something when you go onto Facebook? So these are things that we do to teach the young children to be tech conversant, but they are not necessarily things that we need to use screens or hardcore, even coding skills for at this point in time.
From a personal standpoint, I actually find the question interesting where we say, how do we stop children? Actually, in my house, I'm the problem. So I think it all started with my wife saying that don't look at your emails when we are having a conversation or something. So it's not just kids, it's even adults. We just do two things from a personal standpoint. One is we have clear no device zones, like the dinner table is a no device zone. What has crept in though is the Alexa. We find that an easy way to actually, a lot of times, sometimes you don't remember the name of a song or some celebrity, and then somebody reaches out to the phone to find out. You say, no, you just like ask Alexa now. That's one. And the second is sport. To me, outdoor is the best detox you can have. My son plays tennis, my daughter swims. I always say when you're swimming, it's practically impossible to get to your smartphone, right? So those are two things. I think from a business standpoint, it needs to be blended into the corporate responsibility, right? It's a culture thing of managers expecting people to either respond to emails or pick up phone calls after office hours. I was reading, I think just last week, France has a new law that if you call any of your employees after office hours, you will be arrested, right? So France has released this law. So I think from a business standpoint, it's important to have a culture which says that you will not be penalized if you don't respond to your email after office hours. One, and the second is the same thing about creating enough out of office activities which lets people detox, which lets people collaborate and spend time with each other.
Certainly a lot of ideas in there for all of us from a business perspective. So I want to move on to the government. What can the government do? And a few of the things, especially Arvind, as you were speaking, I was thinking about how a lot of think tanks, banks, businesses, government agencies are all trying to get into the head of the next generation, the millennial. And a lot of what we hear from them is, you want to pair business decisions with the social impact. And they're very adamant about not supporting, whether through consumerism or through their employment, a business that they don't believe in that respect. So, Lena, if I could turn to you and ask about the government's role in all this. Singapore is uniquely positioned in this argument, in this debate and discussion, particularly as the number one in the Digital Society Index. So first to you, I mean, what is Singapore's secret sauce? And is it one of those things where, people on the outside might say, Singapore can do these things right because it's a small 5.5 million person city-state, but can't always replicate these things outside. What can other economies learn from Singapore on digital society?
The rankings are rankings. In general, I think there's still a lot of work to be done. For Singapore, the general approach that we take to governance in general, actually not even for digital society alone, is the government will be responsible for providing the infrastructure, right? Making sure that infrastructure is good, world-class, and providing access. At the same time, curating or organizing the different stakeholders in the market to each contribute to the cause. So even when we look at the Digital Society Index, for example, we generally will score very well in areas to do with connectivity, infrastructure, and even access, because there are lots of programs to subsidize broadband, for example, or computers for low-income families. So the infrastructure will be provided by the government. Then how do we talk about inclusion, about skills, about literacy, and about public education, right, of, say, cyber wellness issues? The approach here is always to organize the stakeholders in the community. So even people like Microsoft, for example, are very good partners for us. We use your Minecraft platform a lot to reach out to kids with parents for activities, for intergenerational activities, so that parents understand why the kids are so in love with Minecraft, and the kids also can explain to the parents that the game is actually quite fun. I do play it with my son as well. So in general, that will be the approach, because Singapore as a government, we are a small government, small country. There's no way that the government can solve all these problems alone, especially when we know that the challenges of the digital society are really the sort of the 20% that is unaddressed, and 80% are the low-hanging fruits that have already been plucked. So that will be our approach in general.
So Arvind and Richard, from a business perspective, what are you looking for from government, and what makes Singapore such a unique and well-positioned place to kind of advance in digital technology?
Yeah,
it could be a thesis question, but if you
I think as Lena just pointed out, the first important area is infrastructure, right? For businesses to succeed, you need to have a infrastructure which works well, is efficient, etc., which Singapore ticks the box very well. The second is to create blueprints and frameworks which enable a private and public sector cooperation. When I look at Singapore, that's something which they've done very well. They've done very well even in areas like artificial intelligence. You're probably aware, I think it was in the World Economic Forum in Davos, where Singapore published a blueprint for AI. It's actually the most talked about initiative. I was in another forum organized by an organization called Horasis last month, and the European regulators were talking about the Singapore framework, saying that it's the only government in the world who's taken the initiative to create this framework and a blueprint of creating. And it's not just the blueprint, they have some focused initiatives, AI for industries. I think it's spelled AI for I, and AI for everyone, which talks to a point about inclusivity. And finally, my favorite, AI for good, which is driving initiatives which impacts social good. So I think it's a combination of those two things which make a big difference.
So if I may add in, I think being here in Singapore, and I do have a lot of engagements with the government, whether it's across IMDA or AI Singapore or CSA, GovTech, many different organizations. I think it's really great here because there is a real genuine not just concern, but really this aspiration by the government to say, look, the digital technology is really changing. That landscape, the kind of opportunity is there for us as a society to really leverage on. But I think one thing that was really great was also the kind of responsibility that we collectively have as well. Whether it's as tech companies or governments, businesses, and the wider civil society as well. So having that early engagements, that dialogue about whether is it the ethical use of AI and data, for example, or open data sharing, or things like tech skills for our silver generation or our young adults through like Microsoft Minecraft, Hour of Code. Those kind of engagements are really, really useful, and I think having that kind of aspiration and having that engagement really early, right at the kind of idea formation type of stage, that is really critical for success. So, and at Microsoft, we have been really, really, honored and privileged to be able to partner with the Singapore government on many, many different levels and initiatives. So this is great, and I think that's one thing that I'll really encourage, countries in the region and around the world to really emulate kind of like that thinking model.
Engagement there, yeah. Well, I have plenty more questions I'd like to ask, but I do want to give it up to the audience to submit questions via Slido, or if you want to wave your hand, we can get a microphone to you. Anyone? Do we have one? First off, can you see that? Is there one that you can see and you'd like to answer? Because I am somewhat blind.
Oh, this is... As a question which says, please recommend activities people can do to have a digital detox. Leave your phones behind. I tried something, I think a couple of months back. Nokia released a banana phone, the phone which basically featured in the Matrix. It's actually a sliding phone. You get it in Challenger. It only does SMS and phone calls, but it also has the snake game for the absolute addicts. No apps, not many apps at least. So get into these things, where you can leave your smartphones behind. Get into sport, like I say, get out places where you can't have connectivity. So it's not an easy thing, but to be compartmentalized areas where there is a no smartphone zone in your lives.
Let me try my hand at the first question, okay? The top one thing you can do, don't sleep next to it. Agree? Put it in another room, please.
I heard from Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir last week, who said he always rags on his youngest minister for carrying his phone around, always on the phone. He said, I don't understand it. People these days, they go to bed with their phones, and I don't get it. Why do they have to do that? So it really hits home with a lot, I think, in this region.
Yeah. Somebody sent me a joke the other day, like all these memes which come out. It's, the classic thing these days is Netflix and chill. They actually turned it to Netflix and single. And, it was like a little picture, and which I found very funny, If you do devices next, then it's going to be Netflix and single, possibly.
So I will try the second question. With so many new emerging technologies, how can you ensure that non-tech savvy consumers keep up with new technologies? So it's a very difficult thing to do, but practically we need to define what are the needs of that consumer in the first place. So for example, for senior citizens, I'm not going to be worried about teaching them, how to program artificial intelligence code or something like that. What do they actually need at that point in their life? And through our surveys, we know, for example, senior citizens, what they would really appreciate is the ability to communicate online. So WhatsApp, for example, has been very useful for our senior citizens because they can do voice memos, which means they can speak and not type. They can use dialects, and other languages to communicate, and they can share photos of their grandchildren and so on. So we do need to deal with it from the point of view of what that segment of the consumer needs, and from there the problem set becomes much smaller and a lot more possible to address. And Richard, I will not sleep with my phone tonight.
Baby steps. Well, we're running short on time, but I just want to give one last opportunity for each panelist. If you have any closing thoughts, anything you want to get in that we didn't get in the short conversation today, if we could just start from reverse end, Arvind, and back this way.
Yeah, I think one point I'd like to make is about, you touched upon the responsibility of government. I feel across markets, businesses don't take enough responsibility for everything that's happening in the digital economy. They're obviously corporate, profit-oriented, and they benefit from the digital economy. But there's too much of finger pointing that the government should do this, do that. This is not an issue in Singapore, but when you look at all emerging markets, if you look at the success of entrepreneurs, any of the big ones, right, Google, Uber, none of them spoke about infrastructure. They all went and succeeded. Gojek, Grab, built their respective platforms and went ahead and succeeded. So I think my one view would be that businesses should take greater responsibility and ownership of doing good for society while they make profit.
So Arvind took the words right out of my mouth. I wanted to make a call to everyone here to say that actually when we think about digital society, we are all part of the society, right? And so everybody actually can play a part, whether it is your own children, your own parents, the broader community, the people around you. Everybody can actually play a part to bring your partners, your friends, your family along in the digital society. Of course, the government, we will play a big part, and we will organize programs, frameworks for businesses, for community partners to come along. But the appeal is really for us to really be a digital society true and true. Everybody in society has a role to play.
And I'll just like to end with this. I think when everybody thinks about technology, it's important to think about this. It can be a tool or it can be a weapon. And it's a very fine line when you think about that, how it impacts your personal life, your children's lives, at work, things like that. So really we have to think about not just the opportunity that is presented by the latest and greatest emerging technologies itself. Yes, it's great, right? Some of it is really cool and what it can do. But I think we always got to come back to ourselves as human beings and think about what should these technology really do. If they are out there and reducing our human dignity, then something is wrong. We have to really think consciously about what these technologies should do. So I think it's important that in your all facets of life, whether you are in the government or in a business or as a parent, just think about that in a more conscious manner. I think it will help to go a long way as the digital society progresses in the coming years.
Well, with that, I just want to thank you all for joining us today, and I wish you all luck for those embarking on digital detox journeys. And thanks again to all the panelists for those insights.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.